The winter front did not roar. It barely even spoke. It simply pressed itself over the landscape like a great, unmoving weight, muting every color and softening every edge. Snow clung to the broken trees and the twisted wire, settling into the quiet spaces where footsteps had once been frantic. Now there was only stillness. The kind of stillness that made every breath feel like a small cloud trying to rise in a world that preferred everything frozen in place. Men stood in narrow trenches carved from stiff earth, their coats stiff with frost, their fingers wrapped around metal that felt colder than the air itself. Even their thoughts seemed to move slowly, as if the cold had crept inward and asked their minds to walk carefully. Out here sound carried strangely, a distant creak of ice, a shovel tapping frozen mud. Somewhere a quiet cough muffled behind a scarf stiff with frost. It was not peace exactly, but it had the shape of it, a fragile imitation carved out of exhaustion. The soldiers learned to move gently in this silence, as though afraid to disturb whatever fragile balance held the world together. And in that pale, breath-fogged quiet, the first threads of the story began to stir, waiting to be noticed.
They had grown used to the cold, or at least they told themselves they had. But the truth was simpler and harder. A body never truly adjusts to a winter like this. The Austro Hungarian soldiers wrapped whatever they could find around their shoulders. Thin blankets, worn greatcoats, scraps of cloth that barely held back the wind. Their breath gathered in the wool, freezing into tiny crystals that scratched their skin whenever they moved. Boots, long past their best days, stiffened overnight, forcing men to stamp their feet just to convince the leather to bend again. Fingers numbed so quickly that simple tasks, tying a strap, striking a match, felt like delicate negotiations with a world growing colder by the hour. They joked about it sometimes, not out of lightness but survival. A quiet comment about frozen mustaches, a shared laugh when someone tried, unsuccessfully, to warm their hands over a candle flame. Yet beneath those small moments lay a deeper truth. These were young men far from home, navigating a war they barely understood, dressed for autumn and trapped in a winter that seemed determined to swallow them whole. And every day, as the frost crept closer, the question lingered: how long could they endure this without something or someone to warm them?
It began as a whisper, passed between men trying to stay awake in the half-light of dawn. Someone claimed to have seen a parcel arrive at a nearby post, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine that didn't look military at all. Another swore he had heard that inside were wool socks, new ones, softer than anything issued by the army. The details shifted with every retelling, but the heart of it stayed the same: warm clothes, sent from somewhere unexpected. At first the soldiers dismissed it as wishful thinking, the kind of gentle fantasy that hunger and cold sometimes stirred up in tired minds. But the rumor kept resurfacing, stubborn as the wind. By the second day, men leaned closer when the story resurfaced around cooking fires, their eyes carrying a quiet spark that hadn't been there earlier. Where were these parcels coming from? Who would send such things to men nearly forgotten at a frozen front? The idea felt too tender to be real, yet too persistent to ignore. Even the most skeptical soldiers found themselves listening, if only for the comfort that the rumor itself seemed to offer. And beneath that growing curiosity, something warmer settled in, the faint sense that the world might have small surprises left to give. In the small French towns far from the thunder of the front, winter settled with a quieter kind of heaviness. Streets that once echoed with market chatter now carried only the soft shuffle of boots and the occasional creak of a shutter wrestling with the wind. Shops stayed open, but their shelves looked thinner each month, and the conversations that passed between neighbors were gentle, careful things, spoken in low tones so as not to disturb whatever fragile peace remained. Families gathered close around modest fires, stretching every ember, every candle, every scrap of wool. Yet even in the stillness, life continued with a stubborn grace. Children played in the frost until their cheeks burned pink, and older women paused to watch them, finding small warmth in the sight.
People carried their worries quietly. News from the front sometimes arrived on paper, sometimes never arrived at all. A missing husband, a wounded son, a cousin taken prisoner. These stories sat heavily in kitchens and parlors, shaping the rhythm of daily life. But through it all, there remained a tender insistence on caring for one another, on keeping some corner of the world gentle. And as winter deepened, that instinct for small kindnesses began to reach beyond the borders of their own homes. For many French civilians, the war's harshness created not only fear, but a quiet stubbornness, a refusal to let hatred dictate the shape of their hearts. They had seen enough hardship to know how easily bitterness could grow, how quickly people could be taught to despise faces they had never met. Posters in town squares urged vigilance. Newspapers framed the enemy in sharp, unforgiving terms. And the constant hum of loss seemed to demand anger as a natural response. Yet some people resisted in ways that no government could track or punish. They resisted by staying gentle. These were ordinary men and women who believed that suffering, wherever it lived, was still suffering. They understood that the young soldiers on the other side of the war, shivering in unfamiliar trenches, were someone else's sons and brothers. And this belief, simple, quiet, almost fragile, became a form of moral defiance. While armies argued and governments demanded loyalty, these civilians held on to an older truth. Humanity was not supposed to be divided by borders or uniforms. Their compassion wasn't loud or heroic. It didn't change battle lines or end fighting, but it chipped away quietly at the idea that cruelty was inevitable. And sometimes, in a winter like this, softness itself became a small act of rebellion. The work usually began in the late afternoon, when the light outside dipped into a soft blue, and lamps were lit one by one along narrow streets. Inside quiet homes, women settled into their chairs with baskets of wool beside them, choosing colors not for beauty, but for warmth. Knitting needles clicked gently in the stillness, creating a rhythm steady enough to soothe the room. The wool softened as it passed through their hands, warming slightly with each movement, gathering into shapes meant to wrap around cold skin far away. A kettle hissed faintly on the stove, and the smell of wood smoke lingered in the air, softening the edges of the long winter evening. There was a peace in these small domestic rituals, a calm that felt worlds apart from the frozen trenches. And in that calm, every stitch became a quiet promise that someone, somewhere, deserved a little warmth. Each piece of clothing carried more than wool. It held the silent thoughts of the hands that made it,
hopes tucked between the rows, small prayers woven into every careful turn of the needle. Some women imagined the face of the men who might receive their work, not in detail, but in feeling. A young stranger, shivering in a place too far from home. Others stitched with memories of their own husbands or sons, believing that kindness sent outward might somehow circle back. The rhythm of knitting became a quiet conversation with the unknown, each loop a wish for safety, each knot a whispered reminder that someone still cared. No messages were written, yet every garment spoke. It carried warmth deeper than its fibers, a warmth shaped by intention. And when these parcels finally left French doorsteps, they traveled with a tenderness that no frost could fully silence, ready to touch the hands of men who never expected such grace.
Moving a parcel across Europe during the war was never straightforward. The continent had become a patchwork of guarded borders, shattered rail lines, and shifting zones of control. Yet amid this fractured landscape, small pockets of order still existed, old postal routes that had been repurposed, neutral countries acting as cautious intermediaries, and humanitarian groups quietly stitching together pathways where diplomacy alone could not. A bundle, wrapped in simple brown paper, might begin its journey in a village post office, carried first by a local courier on a bicycle, then by a train that groaned through valleys dusted with frost. From there, it might pass into the hands of a relief organization, where clerks worked by lamplight, sorting items by destination with patience that seemed almost defiant. Nothing moved quickly, but things did move. Letters and parcels sometimes crossed borders marked by soldiers who examined everything with suspicion, yet allowed certain shipments through because they bore the seals of trusted aid groups. At each stage, the package rested briefly in wooden crates or canvas sacks, bundled alongside hundreds of others, some destined for prisoners, some for families displaced by fighting. Despite the chaos around them, these networks managed to keep a fragile thread of connection alive, proving that even in wartime, people found ways to reach one another.
It was within this quiet, determined system that the warm clothes from French hands began their slow, almost improbable journey toward the trenches. And with each weary mile they traveled, they carried a small piece of stability across a continent trying hard not to fall apart. Every parcel carried a quiet risk, a kind of uncertainty that traveled with it from the moment it left a familiar doorstep. Soldiers at border posts were trained to question anything unusual, and packages that didn't fit neatly into the expected categories could be taken aside, opened, or simply confiscated without explanation. Some guards were suspicious, others merely tired, but all of them lived in a world where trust had become a rare commodity. A bundle of wool socks or a knitted scarf, innocent as they seemed, could draw unwanted attention. Who had sent it? Why? And to whom exactly was it meant to go? These questions lingered in the minds of men who had learned to see danger in the smallest details.
Yet the parcels continued to move. They did so because people on both sides of the lines, quietly and without praise, believed that acts of care should not be treated as contraband. Postal workers sometimes repacked items to make them look more official. Aid groups signed their names with extra flourish, hoping their seals would ease suspicion. Even some guards, recognizing the harmlessness of the contents, let them pass with only a brief inspection. Each of these small decisions carried a shade of bravery, subtle, steady, and essential. And so, through pockets of doubt and narrow gates, the parcels pressed on, carrying with them the fragile hope that goodwill might still slip through the cracks of a divided world.
When one of the parcels finally reached the front, it felt almost unreal, as if it had drifted in from another season entirely. The soldier who first spotted it noticed the unfamiliar twine, the handwriting that was careful but not official, and the faint scent of soap or home that clung to the paper. For a moment he hesitated, unsure whether to call an officer or simply open it himself. Curiosity, softened by weeks of cold, guided his hands. He loosened the knot, peeled back the layers, and revealed something so ordinary it felt extraordinary. A pair of wool socks, thick and freshly knitted, their fibers still holding the faint warmth of the room where they'd been made. Other men gathered around him, drawn by the sight of something that did not belong to the world of mud and frost. No one spoke at first. They only stared, as if the socks were a message written in a language they hadn't heard in months. When someone finally touched them, he did so gently, almost reverentially, surprised by how soft they felt. Tucked beneath the wool was a small note, not a letter, just a few simple words, wishing strength to the soldier who needs this. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be.
The man who received the parcel held it for a long moment, his breath rising into the cold air like a quiet thank you. Around him, others felt a small shift, a warmth that wasn't just from the wool. It was the realization that somewhere beyond the front, a stranger had thought of them, not as enemies, but as human beings worth comforting. And in that tender pause, winter felt just a little less heavy. At first, the men didn't know what to make of it. The idea that French civilians, people they had been taught to fear, or at least to keep at a careful emotional distance, would send anything to them felt almost impossible. Some of the soldiers stared at the parcel as if it were a trick of the light, something conjured by the weariness of winter rather than a real gesture from real hands. They exchanged quiet glances, each one trying to read in the other's faces whether this was kindness or some strange misunderstanding. The war had shaped them into men who expected hardship, not generosity. So when warmth arrived wrapped in brown paper, disbelief came first, settling over them like a second frost.
A few tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the parcel had been misdirected. Perhaps it was meant for prisoners, not frontline troops. Perhaps the sender didn't realize who would receive it. But the handwriting, the simplicity of the note, the softness of the wool, none of it felt accidental. And the more they looked at the gift, the more the confusion softened into something quieter, something they hadn't felt in a long time, the ache of being seen. They thought of their own families, of mothers and sisters who had once sent similar parcels before supply lines stretched too thin. They imagined the civilian who had made this item, sitting by a lamp, unaware of the exact pair of hands it would touch. The tenderness of that image unsettled them in the gentlest way. Compassion from the other side of the war was something they hadn't been prepared for. Yet there it was, resting in their palms, asking them to believe, if only for a moment, that even in the depths of winter, humanity could still cross the lines they had been told were unbreakable.
The warmth of the knitted wool did something the soldiers hadn't expected. It loosened memories they had pressed down for months, bringing them back not with force, but with a quiet insistence. One man found himself thinking of his mother's kitchen, where the windows fogged in winter and the smell of baking bread clung to every corner.
Another remembered the sound of his sister humming while she mended clothes, a tune so simple he hadn't realized how much he missed it until now. These memories rose slowly, like breath meeting cold air, forming shapes they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in a long time. The front had a way of hardening thoughts, turning every emotion into something measured and utilitarian, but holding a gift made by a stranger, someone who wished comfort without ever seeing their faces, broke open a small space inside them. In that space, homes they feared they might never return to flickered back to life. They saw warm rooms, familiar hands, small domestic rituals that once felt insignificant. It filled them with a gentle sadness, but not the kind that crushed them. Instead, it reminded them that they came from places where kindness was ordinary. And for a moment, they felt close to those places again, as if the distance between home and the trenches had narrowed just slightly.
Sometimes, at night, when the wind dipped low and the front fell into its uneasy silence, a man would take out his knitted gift and run his fingers over the stitches. He would imagine the hands that made them, the home where lamplight had glowed on wool, the intention woven into every row. These private moments became a kind of refuge, proof that even in the darkest season, generosity had found its way to them. And in that faint, persistent glow, the trenches felt just a little less cold. In war, choices rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, shaped by fear, exhaustion, and the weight of expectations pressed onto ordinary people. For many, the easiest path is simply to harden, to accept that cruelty is unavoidable and that kindness must wait until peace returns. Yet, the civilians who sent those parcels showed something different. They revealed how fragile and yet how powerful moral choice can be when everything around you insists on division. Their compassion wasn't born from comfort or certainty. It emerged from a landscape filled with grief, rationing, rumors, and the constant reminder that loved ones were in danger. Still, they chose gentleness. These small interventions matter because they challenge the idea that ordinary people are powerless in times of conflict. Their actions remind us that influence doesn't always arrive dressed as strategy or politics. Sometimes it moves through compassion, so quiet it can be mistaken for insignificance. A pair of socks cannot undo a war, but it can remind a cold, weary man that not everyone beyond his trench wishes him harm. And such reminders ripple outward. They shape the stories soldiers carry home. They influence the way enemies imagine each other long after the fighting ends. Even if the civilians never heard of the impact their parcels had, their kindness left a mark, subtle but enduring. In choosing mercy over indifference, they proved that ordinary people can widen the boundaries of what humanity looks like during war. Their actions stand as a quiet assurance that small gestures, made in difficult times, can echo far beyond the moment they're given.
The parcels did more than warm cold hands. They stirred conversations that had not existed before. Word spread slowly at first, carried along trench lines by men who still weren't sure whether they believed what they had seen. A soldier might mention it in passing as he shared a cigarette, and another would lean in, surprised, asking for the details again. These quiet exchanges traveled farther than the parcels themselves. They softened the edges of long-held suspicions, creating small pockets of wonder where hostility usually lived. Some men even wrote home about it, describing the kindness with a tone their families hadn't heard in months. Their letters became gentle reminders that the world outside the war had not entirely surrendered to hatred. As these stories drifted between units, a subtle shift unfolded. Soldiers began to imagine their enemies not just as uniforms silhouetted in the distance, but as people who might also be receiving small mercies from strangers. This didn't end the fighting or erase loss, but it created a fragile space where empathy could breathe. Even officers, usually guarded, always pragmatic, heard the rumors and let them linger, knowing that morale sometimes needed soft things just as much as rations.
The mercy offered by those French civilians didn't stop at the moment the wool touched a soldier's skin. It traveled outward in widening circles, altering the emotional terrain of the front. It reminded men who felt forgotten that someone had reached across the vastness of war to offer comfort. And in a place defined by cold, that memory alone could keep a part of the human spirit from freezing. When winter finally began to loosen its grip, it did so quietly, almost politely. The snow thinned along the edges of the trenches, revealing the dark, familiar earth beneath. Days grew a little longer, and the sun, still pale, still distant, lingered just enough to remind the soldiers that seasons kept their own kind of discipline, indifferent to the war unfolding across them. Battles continued, orders were given, and the front shifted by small, stubborn increments. Nothing changed dramatically, yet everything slowly moved forward, pulled by the momentum of a conflict that refused to pause for weather or weariness.
Soldiers noticed the changes in subtle ways. Boots no longer froze solid overnight. Breath still fogged in the morning air, but it dissipated faster. The wind, once a sharp blade, softened into something closer to a sigh. These signs carried a quiet melancholy. Winter had been cruel, but it had also held moments of stillness that the chaos of war often lacked. Now, as the world thawed, the men understood that new hardships would take its place. Mud replacing ice, movement replacing the hush of cold. Time carried them on, whether they felt ready or not. And as the landscape shifted from white to brown, from silence to distant rumbling, the soldiers accepted that the war moved the way seasons did, slowly, inevitably, and without waiting for anyone to prepare their hearts for what came next. Some memories from the winter faded quickly. The sting of frost on fingertips, the way the wind cut through thin coats, the endless gray of low skies. But the memory of those parcels stayed. It lingered not for its usefulness, though the warmth had mattered deeply, but for what it represented in a season when kindness felt almost impossible. Long after the socks wore thin or the scarves frayed, the soldiers carried with them the quiet astonishment of being cared for by someone they had been told was an enemy. That surprise settled into their minds like a small ember, one that glowed long after the cold had passed. In letters home, some men tried to describe the feeling, though words often fell short. Others kept the memory tucked away, something too personal to explain, yet too meaningful to lose. On nights when the front was restless and sleep felt distant, the thought of those civilian hands moving steadily through wool returned to them, a reminder that the world beyond the trenches still held gentler rhythms. Even years later, when the war had become a story told in fragments, the recollection of that unexpected mercy remained clear. What stayed with them was simple: the knowledge that, in a time shaped by division, someone had chosen connection. And that choice, however small, softened the memory of winter in ways the soldiers never forgot. In the end, what lingered from that winter was not the bitterness of cold or the weight of exhaustion, but a lesson carried in silence. Humanity survives even where it is least expected. The parcels were small things, wool, paper, twine, but they revealed something larger than the war that surrounded them. They showed that compassion could slip through the narrowest cracks, bypassing checkpoints and suspicion, finding its way from one pair of hands to another. In a world divided by uniforms and languages, a simple act of care became its own quiet argument against the idea that people must be enemies simply because someone had drawn a line on a map.
For the soldiers, that truth settled gently over time. They had seen the worst that conflict could offer, yet they had also held proof that kindness did not need peace to exist. It could rise in the middle of hardship, steady and unannounced, like a small flame that refuses to be extinguished. And even after the war moved on, even after the trenches emptied and the years reshaped their lives, that flame stayed with them. The winter had taken much, but it had given them this: the certainty that humanity, though battered and often quiet, endures in the choices people make to soften the world for someone they will never meet.